read, make notes of what you're doing, underline whatever way is comfortable for you, but most of all, do it actively. Engage. Agree or disagree with the author. Compare it to the next reading. Why is Boschken so different from Sassen? You can leave that as a question. But then, jot down some notes, and what you can then send some things which you're writing maybe initially to yourself, send them and post them on the discussion board. 1, 2, save it. Let me put this on. Is yours on? Okay, well if yours is there, and I'll get this out of the way. 2. And I even brought you another little, I think it's here. Yeah, little tripod. As I think it says in the syllabus, maybe briefly, send us, please, an MS Word document, one big file that has everything you've posted and written for the whole course. And we will review it at the end, and ideally, our active TA will read everything over and engage you, and then you reading other comments from this course, who right here you know by recognizing your faces, and or people you often don't. What's wrong with this thing here? I'm getting back to so let me get this back. Why is this thing not working? So this is here. Okay, there we go. I'm confusing with 2 cell phones. So I'm going here now to, I'm going to look, video. And we're going to make a video of this, and I'll start it here. You've already got yours going. I'll catch up, running a little faster, but catching up fast. Okay. Make notes, post them, think about them, reflect on them, and maybe the next day you got something different to say. Say, oh, here's a counter position. Maybe it's the opposite of what I said yesterday. Why? What if I turn it upside down? You turn things around, show that you're playing with the ideas. None of these things are fixed. We have deliberately in almost every section different statements. Okay, I'll do that. Tripod. As these statements are in disagreement, and your fans are here too for you to do anything. If you engage on these things, it shows. And there's the disagreements which are deliberately included in the readings within each section are to help you begin to think and talk and turn them over in your own head. In part, you can then say, okay, here's what I have to say, here's what people and where I grew up, I know, the media I read says this. Now, how would this be different if we were in China? How would it be if we were in, if there's another country, another situation you know better? You live in California. You're from where? California. You're from the Bay Area. Okay, what if you went to San Diego? How would people be different in San Diego? Do you have a sense of that of anything we've said so far in the course?
I used to live in San Diego too.
No, then that's great. Now, as I said, if you've got both with some personal living experience, then you're already, I mean, that's halfway. Once you see that there's not one way, once you get to 2, then you can get to more than 2. Anything noticeable, one or two differences in terms of what we've talked about between the Bay Area and San Diego?
Well, I have some friends down there that were very active during a little bit after George Floyd's death, and so I was really able to see how residents in that area were reacting to like more activism on Black Lives Matter versus the Bay Area, and it was not as well received. Like there was not a lot of support because at the time. A lot of the young
In
people
San Diego or the Bay
in
Area?
San Diego, yeah.
Okay.
Because there is a more conservative community down there, and I think what they really didn't like about the movement was the whole slogan of defunding police. They had a major they had a major issue with that because it was one of their main concerns. My friends did encounter a lot of confrontation. Unfortunately, they lost a lot of friends during that time period because they really understood where everybody's stance was on this, and it was really eye-opening.
Okay, that's great. Within each of them, could you think of some people who said the opposite of what you just said? That is, within San Diego, you're more in favor of Black Lives Matter, and in the Bay Area, you're more supporting the police. Or you didn't know anybody like that?
I didn't know. I'm just like basing this off a lot of my former friends in San Diego, and they found that a lot of like the friends their parents were very conservative, so they had a lot of pushback on that. So there was a lot less support than in the Bay Area for.
No, you're repeating yourself. You're not answering my question.
Sorry.
Did you know any deviants within those two? Is what I'm trying to ask you to do.
No.
So you didn't think of anybody. Okay, now, but because that's interesting that you can tell yourself that I didn't know a single person or whatever group that was substantially different within San Diego or within the Bay Area. Okay, and we talked about that last time. That's cross-cutting state sets and where and why you get. Okay, so this we can keep running. If we can plug this into another end of that same plug, it'll keep on going if it's working right. Please. Okay. That's called deviant case analysis. Okay. Lipset did almost all of his books looking for stuff like that. So when the American Revolution took place, if you were a Tory and you really liked the king and you were living in Philadelphia, what would you do? You'd move to Toronto. And so that made it possible for him not to change his views, him not to have conflicts among his friends, but he moved to a place where people he felt more. And that's one reaction. But if we try to say where and why is Canada different from the US, multiply that by 1 million or 2, maybe not so big, but these kinds of things, that's not the only one, but then you can say where and why do values change, and one kind of theory is that it's what you carry, that you don't really change ever. If you were in Poland, a Polish peasant, you come to Chicago, you're in a Polish peasant neighborhood, you may never change any of these views, etc., or not. So we've got conflicting interpretations, and that's what we're trying to look for the dynamic. Where and how does globalization work? Why do people change any values or not? Do they discover new things? Where and why? Okay. Yes.
I agree with, so what's your name?
Sophia.
I agree with what Sophia said. And similarly, I agree that San Diego is a much less geared towards social justice than the Bay Area, but there's one notable example that I've encountered over the years, that Latinos in San Diego and in the South generally are more conservative than those in the North. And
Than Mexicans in the north, or everybody in the north?
I would, everyone, but I suppose I should specify, I'm talking about Mexicans here, and the
Okay.
reason that is, that Mexican Americans themselves have told me, is that most Mexicans who live in the South are from the north of Mexico, which is traditionally more conservative. I mean, right, Texas, these southern Latino counties in Texas shifted heavily towards Trump in this last election, because those are the same people who just live right across the border in the north, which is tends to be more individualistic and conservative. Whereas people in both the Bay Area and Chicago and these areas are people who came for economic reasons from the South, which has always been much more socialist and collectivist. So that, I think, is basically the one exception to the rule that California gets more conservative. Excuse me, that California, that I guess I that would tend to concur with the rule that California in general gets more left-wing as you go out towards the north. To a point.
I don't want to flash forward too much with getting past things in later sections of the course, which we do go into those very kinds of points very much. But the big points we're sort of linking with what we talked about in a more general manner on Monday, is where and how to think about, look for, compare different perspectives. Is it looking? Is it coming out the right way? Is it horizontal? It's not upside down, or is it your face, or?
It's on you. Yeah.
It's on me. Okay. All right. Let's keep this within the section on Boschken, Sassen. Boschken is a true blue Californian, but he knows it very, very well. And his wife is or was the superintendent of schools of Sacramento. So before, during, and after Prop 13. So she lived through the revolt of the taxpayers, managing schools, cutbacks, these kinds of issues. Boschken, was a student of Aaron Wildowski, and we'll be more about Wildowski's work on values, culture, all kinds of other things. But he and Wildowski was a student in turn of Dahl. So I'm placing them a little bit with that kind of lineage pluralism. That is, you could say that Sassen has a view of globalization it is not a very explicitly differentiated concept. It's mainly Wall Street, but she doesn't say, well, there's globalization for production, which is my job in Wall Street, and here's globalization for consumption. I'll just flash forward to bring this out. She has a chapter on consumption. If you dig it out, any idea, have a clue as to what she says? That is, she often does she combines elements of Marx and Weber, of Lenin, but she doesn't say there's a difference between Lenin and Marx and Max Weber, or Adam Smith. she sort of puts them all together and says, oh, this is the way the world is. Okay, Boschken is the opposite in that sense. He's more like Dahl. Dahl's big idea of issue specificity. Not only there's the leadership or the top elite. Instead, he says life and politics are about specific issues. And the school board politics is different from the mayoral election politics, is different from the economic development. And you get different actors, different rules of the game, even though it's the same city. And if you look at these Budweiser beer circles of concentric circles, they call Venn diagrams, they had almost no overlap except for one person whose name was Richard Lee, the mayor. And nobody else really were involved in all these three issue areas. Okay, Sassen is more like Hunter, the elitist in that sense. Dahl is again saying the same thing as Goldovsky, is saying the same thing as Boschken. We're saying they're different issues. Grain politics may be different if you own a flour mill. Maybe you do one thing when it's voting for mayor. Maybe it's different if you're supporting the school board, and maybe that would be, and then subsidies for farmers or something else. So then so my point is not that one is right or wrong inherently, but that there are, my linkage here is, it depends on the kinds of context you're working in, looking at, like San Diego versus, so that is, you can say I like or I dislike supporting the police or not supporting the police, but the question is, why is that in your head if you feel that way? If you ask yourself, or I don't care, or I want to do what the crowd says, or police are always butchers and I'm always against the police, or the opposite. Everybody's equally good and we don't want to treat them differently just because they happen to wear a blue badge. They've got a job to do, etc. And so there are very different ways of reframing the same thing in abstract terms. But the question is, if you try to say where and why did they come from, even if it's in your own head, even if it's your parents, even if it's people around you, where and why might they differ if you go to, so we have we've heard one clear answer. Maybe the people from southern Mexico are different from the northern Mexicans, but they don't change at all when they go to California, basically, or don't change much. And that's Elazar's migration pattern. That what's in your head you take when you move, but you don't really change much at all. So where and how these kinds of things are different ways of looking for, that is, if you don't look for different issue areas, as Boschken is doing, and you just do what Sassen says, and then if you look at her chapter, and I'll give you a quick hint, and you can read it if you can't believe I'm even imagining this. Look at her chapter called Consumption. There ain't no dynamics. There's no thinking, there's no activity about where and why consume differently. And consumption is basically the same kind of thing as production. If you work on Wall Street, you have to have a chauffeur, you have to have a nanny, you have to have a chef who makes nice stuff for you, you have to live in a high-end apartment in, middle, north Manhattan, etc. But there's no choice, as if even if you've got multi-million dollars there, you have to have a chauffeur. You have to do this, is what Sassen is saying. She doesn't give any differentiation among the lines, whereas Boschken is continually saying, everybody's got different bits of globalization in their own heads all the time. And so he talks about markets and product. I mean, so Sassen is one, but other things include another one, which the city's an entertainment machine. I wrote a book, published a book with that title. Entertainment has a different dynamic. So what the book does is to go through all the social sciences, economics, political science, geography, sociology, anthropology. What do they say about entertainment as a different kind of thing from work? Most of social science, and for people at the USC, who most of us work all the time, we love it, we're doing it, we keep doing it for years. But most of the world is not like that. Most of the world don't like their work, or many, if not all, and they want to do other things, and they want to, even if it for some people it's sitting drinking a beer and watching television. Others will turn on sports. Others will say, no, I don't want to be others will say, no, I'm not a passive observer. I'm going to put out my running clothes. I'm going to stretch for 20 minutes. Then I'm going to go out and do 5 miles a day. And then you don't drink beer and sit and watch television. So that is, Sassen doesn't say anything about things like that. Even if you may have a lot of money under your pillow, or you may have none. She implies that the money is there, and it tells you what you have to do. Your job defines who you are, and you can't do anything different. So what the book does, and what Boschken is pointing to, is saying, hey, look at these different dimensions, because they have different, if I use the term, I use it as a quick shorthand, rules of the game, to say that there are some norms. These are called norms by sociologists. And so they're called values, and norms are interconnected. The values are more general, like egalitarianism, transgression, localism. These are bigger values, but when we get to norms, of things like don't cross the street if the light is red. Okay, that's a norm, and you get a ticket from the law if you violate that law in some cities and some countries. In Chicago, not very often, especially these days. So, nevertheless, many people know that those rules are there, and then where and why they may get created or institutionalized, is that bigger term used, and then where and how do they fit together and why. These are kinds of things which you have to think about if you're looking separately from economic development to entertainment. And what can we learn from the best anthropologists who talk about this, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what we try to do in distilling propositions from all different kinds of fields around the social sciences. But the main thing, to my shock, was how little there was, and how much most of social sciences is all about work. Or a little bit of ethnicity, a little bit of tradition, something like that. But I'll end that for now. Let me push on with, okay, so I made the big point about Boschken versus Sassen, and for the multidimensionality. Let's not forget the number one at the top, Adam Smith. You all know about Adam Smith. I'll ask you one big question. What is there about globalization in what we read? Yes?
He says how societies develop around water and use water. Societies will become more developed if they buy water, because transportation is less expensive, moving product is less expensive, industrialization is made easier, and societies that develop in absence of water, because sub-Saharan Africa, as his description, because they're so far from civilization, don't have access, they don't develop to the same lengths.
Okay. Perfect example. What's the bigger way that he frames it? And he has a couple of words, he doesn't use it a lot, He doesn't introduce it and say, I want you to teach this concept for me, but he uses it, and it's a big idea which subsumes everything you said. Then that gets us a little more, everything is great as far as it goes. Can we generalize it a little more abstractly that fits more with what Smith is saying, and then illuminates this whole section and the whole course? That is how Milton Friedman, the classic Chicago economics approach. What do they say that fits with that, but that is more general and that is, why not just water? How about railroads? How about airplanes? How about motor scooters? Chariots, before they had chariots.
So access to technology increases globalization.
Does he stress that? Not very much in that section. And so technology, I mean, you mentioned as a word, but where and how would it help? How is it a proposition, a more abstract proposition than your water example? Anybody else? I mean, it's a nice, short, brief. Yeah.
The specialization.
Is the what?
The specialization.
You say industrialization? Is that what-
Specialization.
Specialization. Okay. All right. Now, yes. I mean, that's part of it, but it's a little bit different. I mean, if the having water or not is basically the introduction, is the proposition, and so that per se doesn't really use specialization. I mean, your point is right. I mean, specialization is right at the core of Smith, but what is there about specialization which drives it? Yeah.
Like using the division of labor so that less people have to move things.
Yes. Okay. So division of labor, big central concept, but you then say, and therefore you don't have to do things yourself.
Yeah.
You could potentially have USPS carry the mail instead of you carrying it yourself. But if we then ask why, in your example, that Africa is different, is it because they don't have water in the middle of the desert? No. That's your proposition. How can we get beyond the water, which is not just specialization, but which is something else, which is like, or say, put differently, imagine you live on Fifth Avenue, you take your chauffeur down to Wall Street. Why in Sassen's analysis are you paid more than the person who takes the subway? And the answer to that should illuminate your question about the people in
Because you have the means to pay for it. Like, you're able to allocate that amount of money for a cab versus the subway. Or is it a time claim? Your time's more important, so you spend more money to get somewhere faster.
From the standpoint of one individual, yes, for sure. I mean, descriptively, that's 100% right. But the question is, why does your job pay you to give you the money to buy the chauffeur? Or let me put it differently. People, let's say, this is a high-end person in a Wall Street firm. There may be another person who works for a charity who helped the poor, the disadvantaged, and because that building used to be a bankrupt bank, and so the city took it over. And I visited myself in Wall Street, and their entire buildings, they got foreclosed, taken over by the city of New York, and they'll give it out for low rent, whatever, to people who are social workers, things like that. So working on Wall Street, if you are working as a social worker manager, you may be earning a little bit more than a regular social worker. But compared to people in the next building, you're not doing finance. Okay. Then take another, say the building after that, say that's called Chase Manhattan, or say you're Chase, and you work as a teller. So people come in, they give you checks. So I'd like to deposit $20 check, fine, and I'd like to take out $30 because I gotta buy some stuff for my kids for Christmas. Okay, so then, if you were working as a teller in Chase Manhattan in a big building right on Wall Street, are you gonna get paid a lot for taking in those checks? No. Will you have a chauffeur? No. Okay, so what makes it different between the social worker, the teller, and the guy in the catalog? In Adam Smith's terms.
It's more
It is
skilled.
what? Why do people who do some kinds of work on Wall Street make them get paid more? Why? How can, I mean, everybody would like to be paid more, maybe, but what do you do and why does the market, so-called, reward you?
It's more skilled labor and like you're adding more value to the economy.
Yeah, both of those are right, but why specifically, which matches up with Smith's analysis and which fits with Boschken and Sassen? Yes.
So due to like the efficiency of which you produce it, so like for example, the Wall Street person, if like the amount of money they make for a company in like 10 minutes is so like drastically different than like a bank teller or a social worker, so that 10-minute or hour long it's quicker to do a chauffeur is however millions of dollars for that company that person can make at that time. So when talking about it in terms of like Smith, why the wealth of nations of like European countries at the time is different from like Africa is because the infrastructure at that time was more advanced in Europe, so there could be more efficiency.
Wait, not too many variables in this.
Okay.
Well, let's stay with the one person who, why is that one person, yes, that person can use his or her resources more efficiently by having a chauffeur, perhaps, which is not true if it's really trafficy, but assuming it is. But why, if you're the president of that company that's deciding, let's say, how much will we pay the teller and how much will we pay the guy who is, let's say, he's an investment banker, and he makes deals that involve people buying and selling in Brazil and China, not just in Wyoming or Ohio.
Like, why do you pay them more?
Yes.
Because they can like make more profit for the company. Like their skills make more profit for the company, so their value of their labor is higher.
Yes, I mean, all these things are right, but you're missing and I'll give it to you now because we don't want to spend too much time again. Don't want to be semantic, but we do want to show that Smith stresses this concept, and you can derive many of the middle level and lower propositions which are in his text in your own thinking about it. And you haven't no one has articulated the concept which Smith is introducing, which is the big concept of the whole idea in globalization. What is globalization? Why does globalization make the world different? And to make it more like that guy in the Cadillac. And what's the title of the book? The Wealth of Nations. And he says it goes up for nations if they do the right things. And what's the right thing in Smith's terms that help to subsume almost everything that you've said?
Free markets.
Yes, more free markets. Take an example. So, go ahead.
I would say either the ability to produce or money.
Say that again?
The ability to produce, because I remember that like he kind of conveys the idea that like the wealth of a nation is not measured by like the amount of money that they have, rather their ability to produce. So
That's not the bigger dynamic. That is, put differently, many of your examples are framed in more individualistic terms. I have more resources, I have a car for me, and I'm more efficient, or I'm living in the Sahara. If you move up one level, let's talk about the wealth of nations. How can you, if you're the king or you're the president, how can you make the whole nation have become more wealthy and do better if say you're the president of Mexico or somewhere else? And what is there that would be consistent with the questions and the answers you almost all given? So you've talked about the division of labor. I mean, you have big things that are close. I mean, they're division of labor, specialization. Clearly, those are core big concepts, which he uses in the sections which you've read. But those are still things. You're still looking at things more individually. If you think more structurally, let's say for the entire nation, or for let's say a region within Italy, big regional differences within Italy. But the and one thing he talks about is what he calls, I'll give you a hint, corn laws. It sounds archaic perhaps, but what's an example of that fits with the discussion right here? It's a law. It's not one person. It's a government action that is transforming the economy, where there are corn laws and they have regulations or potential fees or taxes. How does that change the wealth of nations? It limits your activity, but more, and so government actions in trying to redirect or constrain the actions of what producers and consumers are doing makes them less wealthy because of what? Okay, his term was the extent of the market. The extent of the market. And we can call that globalization. That is, you can, if your whole economy depends you and your friend who lives across the street, and he grows corn and you grow pigs, and you exchange those and someone else. I mean, you have three people. You've got a small, simple economy, and you can't have cars. You can't have fancy clothes. You can't do other things. You only have corn and pigs, and so forth. But if the extent of the market gets bigger, and you go all the way to London, or all the way you go to Paris, then you go all the way to China, then the extent of the market can bring a much broader set of producers and consumers and bring you much more, not only these other things that you've talked about, yes, still hold, but the structural thing which he hugely stresses through the whole book, that is, it's not that he's against government itself. What he's trying to do is to say, if we narrow the extent of the government, it doesn't permit as much division of labor, as much specialization, as much an increase of efficiency and more productive individuals, because we can connect to China, we can connect to Paris as well as to London, as well as to one little county. And if you only keep it very, very, very small, the extent of the market is so small, you're going to be poor. Okay, that's the big concept. I'm not to say everything else you've said is good, but the other thing I'm also showing you, which the economists are I'd say the best in the social sciences, they're the most rigorously logical about how they think and write and build their theories. That X leads to Y, Y leads to Z, and that implies that we ought to bring in W, and let's see how this works. And then so they'll talk about this. And so when I've said deliberately, I'm sort of playing economist here, in terms of Smith's own thinking, I'm illustrating They may be things which are better and less good in terms of the logic of the analysis. And that's a contribution, good and bad, but that's a major kind of way of thinking that the economists do a whole lot more than do sociologists or anthropologists. And so, so anthropologists, for example, say, it's really good. He does really good field work because he's got local knowledge. Comes out of the earth. Okay, local knowledge. So the anthropologists have a sense of he really knows. He's an expert on northern versus southern Mexico. He knows all the differences between the two and why they moved to different parts of California and things like that. But the point is, what good does it do about other things? Okay, so I'm saying look for the logic, look for the strength of what we can. That is, instead of saying, do you like this city or that city, as people often ask me, which city is the best? I'm saying each social science has its strengths and its weaknesses. And if they're really weak, what happens in this building, or at least it used to be this building, social science division, they kick you out. We had education, we closed it down. We had geography, closed it down. Planning, sent away and went to California, closed it in Michigan. We had the top people, we had the top planners in the world. They were right here, but they weren't as good as the best of social science in the same building. So in that sense, we can learn more if we build on the best of what we've got from adjacent fields, and if they're differentiated in the kinds of knowledge they have. So the division of labor among the disciplines or the fields within any one discipline that you're majoring or thinking about majoring in, you can learn from maybe one subfield by adapting from another. Or if you take math courses, you can use math in order to do X something better. Or if you learn more about biology, you may decide you should run further or run less. We had a little chat about how far should you run. And I did 3 marathons and I'm still suffering from it. So I'm telling you can, and if you also can learn from, that is, if you can learn from division of labor and you can learn from reading books and seeing others that make mistakes, then you can save your body and your mind. Okay, any other comments, questions about Smith? Yes?
I don't know if it's but for me, I was not able to really connect the concept of extent of the market to the example of like the 3 people in New York and like one making more than the other.
No.
Like I understood the global part, but I wasn't able to connect to the.
Good to bring that up. Absolutely. No, I mean, if we miss that, then that's critical. Anybody else want to give it a shot? Why should the guy in the car get paid more than the 2 others?
The guy in the car is dealing with people that live in London, apparently like he's training internationally, while the people, like the social worker is only working with people from New York, and the cab driver is only working with people from New York.
So that the extent of the market within which these 3 people act is much bigger for the person who's going to China and so forth. And people said, aha, you can bring potential, that is, you may be able to find out cheaper ways to buy the raw materials and more expensive ways to sell it, that you can increase the profit of the firm. And we can pay everybody even the tellers can be paid more because he figured out a new, different niches. So I'm simplifying, but something like that. So the extent of the market so I'm using the example of price, simple, just price. But what if instead you can say, well, here's a new fantastic thing, textiles, beautiful, and it comes from China, and it's called silk. We don't have anything like silk in England. And so if you import the silk, then you've got a very nice, expensive product which the extent of the market can bring into trade, etc. And then in turn you can pay more to the Chinese to get their silk and ship them back cheap textile for people who can't afford silk in China, etc. Something like that. So, so there are many variations, but this one of the smart things that Sassen does is to combine that reasoning. The extent of the market is classic Adam Smith. So Sassen, to simplify, Sassen equals Adam Smith plus what? What's the big other bit that is, and if you scan some of the syllabus with our little boxes and arrows, we gave you a hint or two, but anybody, what else is there in Sassen that is individual bits which atomistically are different, but what's a whole major or put it this way. There are lots of people on Wall Street and the New York Times are saying things that you're reading about. Ukraine, Russia. People have sometimes said that the Russians and the Chinese learned about capitalism by reading Marx. They don't read Adam Smith, but they didn't traditionally. So if Sassen were Chinese, she'd only use not Adam Smith. Who might she use if she was trying to do a book about globalization? Who wrote about this? Marx? Did Marx write about globalization? Not really very much at all. Did anybody who read a lot more Marx write a lot more about globalization 50 years later, roughly? His name was Lenin. And Lenin wrote about imperialism, so that these countries that got richer with those English factories are selling textiles, making more money, and they then become imperial countries, and they take some, it may be military, it may be economic, whatever, but they build empires, and that this builds a bigger and more great extent of the market, but it's also drawing raw materials away from the poor proletarian countries and shipping them something back which is less attractive to them, so they are being exploited. They're being treated in ways that lead, within England, they can lead to people who, poor people may serve in the army, and many of those will get killed. And then it may be that those who let's see, I'm trying to look for one or just a clear, simple. Well, I want to illustrate one or two big concepts. Exploitation, which is the implication that there's the right, I won't say right and wrong, but that you can raise the price or lower the price, to stick with metaphors that are closer to Smith, or so for instance, if well, if we have not only imperialism, but we have capitalism, and we have, and so Marx did stress the conflict among the classes, the concentration of wealth, more capital, and growing in the hands of those who are larger and larger capitalists, they would buy out smaller firms, they'd kick out the owners, former owners, may not have, maybe you didn't steal them, maybe you bought the house legally, that bought the farm, but you then say, you can't, it's mine now, and this then becomes part of a larger and larger farm area, and that in turn may lead to things like economies of scale. You can do them cheaper because you've got, thousands of acres instead of just 10 acres, which you can't do so efficiently. So what Sassen does is to say, or let me flash forward. We've got Marx, we've got Lenin. Lenin talked about imperialism, which was adding the international ideas of Marxism, and he took it to richer and poorer countries to show how the richer countries, as they were getting more monopolistic and capitalist and stronger and bigger within their countries, they take the same logic and do the same things internationally. And these in turn can often lead to, if we're going to aim toward a communist revolution, is we've got to have war. That is, we've got to have if we're the poor people, we've got to fight against the big capitalist countries because they're against capitalism, and we want something better and different. So we want to revolt against the big monopolistic countries and their economies. Even if they want to sell us nicer goods, and even if they're cheap, maybe they're still higher in price than if we were in England, for instance, in this example. So what Sassen then does is to put the two together, and then she adds one more little bit, which is creative, which is to say, let's look at the city, not just the nation. Let's look at New York, and within New York, let's look at really Wall Street, which illustrates this extent of the market and the change as there's been more and more of an extent of the market in the mid-20th century. So what she did, and then she gets to the getting to this. Put my picture up here. My little globalization leads to inequality. That's her new idea. This wasn't stressed by Marx or Lenin per se, and they didn't talk about cities in a distinguishing way. The title of the book is The Global City. Cities like New York and London and Tokyo are the three cases that she uses to suggest that they are very different than most other cities where people may buy and sell within and so cities, she simplifies and calls them global cities, but the rather naively or simplified manner, we could instead say, we could try to measure the extent of the market and then give a score that may be high if we're on Wall Street in Manhattan than we are in another part of New York, or especially if you are a more self-contained economic system. And so, as we have those people who are earning lots of money going down in their limousines, she then makes the next point that there may not be enough people to be drivers of limousines, or enough people to be nannies. And so in New York, they create new jobs, and people leave Mexico or leave Costa Rica or leave Poland, and they become nannies and chauffeurs, and the disparities in income increase between the rich and the poor because of these and the way she puts it, she doesn't use the term taste very much at all. And you have to have a nanny, you have to have a chauffeur, and that's going to be 2 more jobs, but they're low paid jobs, and the point is, New York will have a bigger rich and poor disparity. There will be inequality among New Yorkers will increase because of the globalization. That's the big idea of Sassen. That's the top line. Globalization generates more inequality. So this is anybody wants to add any question or raise any issues about that part? Because what I want to do, I want to go down through 4 models, and we're going to start with Sassen, and then we're going to show how we can refine Sassen by these others. But any questions about what I've said? That is, I'm skipping over, which is laid out in the section. You've only got an introductory overview of the whole book, but the core ideas are there. Question?
I have a question. How would that relate to the idea of like crossing boundaries? So, for example, how people from non-car countries would go to those countries to serve as like nannies or drivers, in terms of from a legal perspective, like how would she reply to that, like visas and stuff?
Yeah. Good question. Is there any government in Sassen's section? No, not a line about it. And more generally, if you look through the book, there's no government, there's no politics, there's no culture, and no details about consumption dynamics. So I mean, I taught courses with her. We had students working together and so forth, and I would say from the beginning, Saskia, you got to add government back in here. I mean, aren't there? And then so I give examples, and she said, "Oh, yes, you're right. Of course, we know. Yes." But she then in her later books, she has used and written much more about government. But this is her main scholarly contribution, and it had and has no government there. So she ignores all that stuff. But in terms of, it's a black box in terms of her theorizing. That is, her focus is on, in this case, New York, and the New York's economy. That is of one unit, and she's in that sense she's reasoning away of sort of building an economic model that simplifies by leaving out a lot of other things, which she knows are there, but I say that as well because her heart. Let me add one more important point. Her heart was on the left, strongly left politically. So when there were active discussions, either in the news or among students, and the people she would invite to come to a seminar, there are many very leftist Marxists and others. What's he really going to say that's new? And so, but he's the top Marxist in Argentina and so forth. Or say one guy came from Mexico. He's really, was a brilliant Mexican analyst. And at the end of the talk, I said, I've heard. I don't know that much about the Mexican economy. I've heard that people have to pay bribes to get things, visas or permits to export or to hire people and to get people jobs or to things like that. Is that true that you have to pay bribes to government officials? Oh, of course. That's the way the Mexican economy works. Not a word in Sassen. And not a word in the whole discussion by the Mexican economists. So they know it's there. But that's one point. Point 2, she can be very emotionally unhappy, stressing. Those poor people are suffering, how poor they are, those nannies, these chauffeurs. And she'd talk about going, and she'd go back to Argentina, she'd go to a small town, they'd be having a sit-in. So I want to go down, I want to have the hot dog, I want to talk with the people in the street, it's cold, I'm with them, I'm supporting those people, etc., etc. But so she was doing politics. She was talking to the students and to the others, to the people who were there. She was saying, you know, I'm taking a position, but she didn't build it in. So I'm saying other people, such as a different, if you're in London, there was one English geographer who wrote a paper called Why Sassen is Wrong. And the answer was, we have a welfare state in England, and they have a much weaker welfare state in the US. And so the inequality, that is the flexibility of more nannies coming in and being kicked out when there's a recession or something like that, that in and out, those anti-immigrant policies will guarantee, if they come to London, they'll get unemployment compensation more generously, whereas you're not allowed to get any unemployment compensation until you've already worked for maybe a year or something like that in New York. That is, I'm not worried about the details so much as to say there are more anti-inequality policies in welfare states like England, or stronger still, of course, in France. Okay, so that's model 2. Model 3 is we can have two different kinds of causal paths here. Globalization may lead to inequality, but if we have knowledge and adaptation of the a strengthening, you can have for left parties an anticipation that if we're going to do this globalization, we may have more inequality than what they've done, say, in Thailand. In Thailand, they've said, no more of these NGOs coming to our hospitals, because they're supposed to, we're happy to have nurses and doctors come here and social workers, but if you start talking to women, you ought to work on, you know, women should be paid the same amount as men. You say that in Thailand, that's revolutionary. So they said, not only, they didn't fire one person, they didn't kick out nurses. They said, no more NGOs. These foreigners are bringing bad ideas. So if you have an anticipation of what might happen, then you as a political leader can act in a way that will counter the consequences of globalization. And so you can have either more inequality, or you can have anti-inequality policies which prevent those things from happening. And these can then be debated among experts about how to do it, but at least knowledge about these anticipated potential impacts will change the structure of the relationships, such as globalization and inequality. Finally, model 4 here is take Asia. People don't pay as much attention to Sassen. They don't pay as much. They traditionally have not paid that much attention to markets. They talk much more to personal relationships. Much more. I mentioned the bribes in Mexico, and it's not just simply bribes, but also you do things with people you know, you buy and sell from them. That's life. And you also hear this in Chicago. Chicago politics talks the same way. A good Irish Chicago politician talks that same way as people may in Japan or Korea or China. So this was there long before Mao. So this is not uniquely Chinese, as I say. I'm using Japan and Korea and Singapore in a good part there. What I'm saying here is there are other variables besides globalization increase or decrease inequality and these kinds of policies. And so Sassen has not, when I give you the example, she did not, where these people Where do these nannies come from? Do they get visas? How does that work? Not mentioned. Other variables are left out heavily, and if you leave out all the politics and culture, you're going to do a simplified version of economics too. So those are the alternative ways of framing some of this, which the literature has gone beyond her, and she in turn has changed. I mean, she's added more politics, but she still tend to do it in a highly, I would say, from a first social science standpoint, pretty ideological, personalistic. You know, I want to be there on the ramparts, fighting the good battle. I want to be there with the people who are protesting in the street with them, and that's part of social science. Maybe she doesn't say it, but it's part of her style, even though she wouldn't say a word about the visas or the government or the bribes or the government. I mean, why isn't the government helping those poor people? She didn't. Okay, so I want to get through at least. Well, let me ask. Has anyone read on, and you want to ask any more about any of the other readings? And it's good to take a look at the others. Otherwise, I'll give you a sentence or two on each of these points. But some key points you ought to take from these. And these all have short, but 2, 3, or 1 star. What have you learned in any of these, or have any questions about them? Let's take Jeroen van der Wal. Anybody look at this? He's read all this literature very carefully, did a PhD on it, and he follows all of this literature in part, and he also included I was on the dissertation committee, as was a top English guy, who I think he was the same one who wrote the papers Why Sassen is Wrong. Came from London, and one thing which I haven't mentioned yet, but I'll just bring it in, because one specific thing which the division of labor and specialization line, which you've mentioned, is a type of activity which makes Wall Street and New York and global cities distinctly important and powerful. And that's called law firms, accounting firms, travel agencies, or people who do things for you which help you. If you're the General Motors, if you're General Motors, you don't know what's going on in China, or you don't know about certain kinds of this or that. That is, there are other firms that, and this is also the one of. Okay, I'll keep it simple. These are called producer services, and they're critical leavening for a global city. They make for more inequality, is what she's talking about here. So Jeroen van der Wal tested this, as this is the same thing. The earlier was an MA published by me and Sassen and a student, an MA student here from China. She measured differences across not just 3 cities, or only New York. And she took all the metro areas in the US, and then she measured inequality in income, and then she measured the importance, causal arrows, measuring like these kinds of causal paths, adding other variables, a bunch of other things which Sassen had not used. She hadn't controlled some critical things. So part of what she's maybe saying may be spurious. So what Jeroen van der Wal did by analyzing his data were for the Dutch locations, and he had some of them were more global, trading more internationally, etc. And then he had measured inequality, so he had globalization and inequality, but he then added something else. he added people. Do you like to work with people who are different from you? Do you like to work with people who have different kinds of languages? Do you enjoy being in the same office? That is, he's measuring tolerance and challenge or resistance to immigrants, or what you can call ethnocentrism. And he found that this was a much more important driver among Dutch locations than was producer services or that is, it's part of globalization, but in turn it's been okay. So Jeroen van der Wal is saying that a lot of the spuriousness, the big path of the number one is simplified because it's much bigger than is really true, because it's partially undermined by ethnocentrism. Okay, so we can call that an other variable here, which she hadn't really talked about. We can call it cultural. But we're going to stop now for this point, and we will. And so we have a holiday on Monday. It's Martin Luther King Day. So we'll be back again in 1 week on Wednesday. And thanks for the good discussion on the extent of the market.
Good that we have Monday off, because do you know what the temperature is with the wind chill? It feels like on Monday, negative 36 degrees.
Okay, that's great.
So it's good that that's the day we have.
Okay. Now, I spent 10 years of summers in Alaska. I love the extreme.
Right.
The hot and the cold.